Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Disability and Accessibility Resources webinar. I think I'll give folks just another minute to show up. We're expecting a couple more people, and then I'll introduce our presenters and we'll get going.
Sounds good. I have a question for you all. I just turned my fan on. Can you hear it? Or is it filtering out the background noise?
I can hear it, but it's more ambient.
Hmm. I wonder if...
Oh, it looks like it's being filtered out for some, though.
I
Now
hear
can you hear?
soft, yeah, background
Okay.
noise, but it's not acting for me.
Okay. I might keep it for now. Okay, cool. Not distracting at all. Thank you. Folks, if it does become distracting, please let me know and I can turn it off.
It is nice and warm here today in Portland.
Yeah.
Yes.
No AC in many of these older buildings. Hmm.
All right, I think we can go ahead and get started.
Perfect.
Yeah. Once again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. This is the Admission Office's Disability and Accessibility Resources webinar. And my name is Maddie Reese. I'm an Assistant Dean of Admission here at Reed, and I'm joined by Jess Gibson, who's Director of Reed's DAR Center, and Maddie Willen, Assistant Director. And they're going to give you the rundown on all things disability and accessibility resources at Reed, and also have time to answer your questions. So you'll see this call is structured as a webinar, so you can type out questions in the Q&A function, but you won't need to unmute or anything like that. And you can also DM me if you need anything. But with that, I will pass it over to our presenters to get started.
Thank you. Well, we have two Maddies with us today. My name is Jess Gibson. I'm the Director of Disability and Accessibility Resources here at Reed. I have been at Reed for almost 13 years now. Prior to that, I worked as a social worker here in the Portland area. I love Reed, and I'm really excited to be with you today and share with you how we can start working with your students. And I will let Maddie introduce herself.
Hello, my name is Maddie Willon. I'm the Assistant Director of Disability and Accessibility Resources. This will be my fourth year here at Reed, so practically a senior myself, I guess. Prior to coming to Reed, I've worked in special education in a variety of settings and high school settings, clinical settings, and have a background in behavioral therapy. And like Jess, I love working here at Reed.
Great. So today, here is what we're going to talk about. Just a little bit about what is this office? What do we do? What kinds of accommodations could students expect to receive at Reed? A little bit on the change from high school to college. How do students get connected with our office, get started with our process? We always have questions about what kind of documentation is needed, so we'll talk about that, as well as how do students interface with their faculty around accommodations, and then some non-accommodation resources that every student at Reed has access to that might be especially helpful for students with disabilities. Um, there are automated captions available today. So if you look down on your screen, you see the Show CC button. If you click on that, it should enable the automated captions. As Maddie Reese said, you are welcome to submit your questions into the Q&A section. I recommend that if it's a general question about our process, please go ahead, ask it. Chances are there's someone else who's wondering the same thing. If it's a more individualized question that's specific to your student or your family situation, then I would recommend scheduling an appointment with us so that we can speak a little more freely without having to be concerned about your student's privacy. Okay, so who are we and what do we do? There are three of us here at Reed in this office, me, Maddie, and Josanne Quitta, our accommodations coordinator. Maddie and I are the ones who are in our student-facing roles, so your student is likely to interact with one of us. Josanne provides crucial but behind-the-scenes administrative support. Um, what we're here for basically is for access and inclusion. So, of course, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. We want to make sure that our students with disabilities aren't being excluded from our programs, that they have the ability to participate as fully as possible as their non-disabled peers, that they have the chance to benefit from what Reed has to offer. Um, Sometimes people ask us, are you advocates for students? And I say yes, insofar as we are advocating for them to have equal access. Um, it might be slightly more accurate to say that we are advocates for access. I know that's a minute distinction, but I think it might become more clear as we go through our presentation here. And of course, we care deeply about all of the students that we work with. So even at times, if we're finding that accommodations aren't quite the right fit, we'll still work to connect students with resources that will be helpful in supporting them in their journey at Reed. Let me see. How many students at Reed have a disability? As of this last year, about 29% of our enrolled students were registered with my office. Um, Over the last 4 years, our incoming student classes have reported 47% of students have shared that they have a disability or they identify as a student with a disability. 42% of our incoming students identify as a student with a non-visible disability. So I say that just to share that your students will be in good company, that we have a robust office here that is well used to working with students. Our faculty are very familiar with our accommodation process. So hopefully that provides some reassurance about knowing what to expect when your student arrives at Reed. Okay, what kinds of disabilities would qualify? What kinds of accommodations are available? Basically, any student who has a medical condition or a mental health condition that is having a big impact on their student life could potentially qualify for accommodations here at Reed. Not all students who have disabilities need accommodations, right? 47% of our students identify as having a disability, 29% are registered with us. So clearly, there's a good number of students at Reed who don't require an accommodation. Um, there are some students who arrive at Reed thinking, I'm not sure if I need accommodations, and change their mind and connect with our office later. That's fine too. Um, I would say the most common conditions or disabilities that we see here amongst our student body are what we call the neurocognitive or neurodevelopmental conditions, such as ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, as well as psychological conditions, so students who might have mood disorders or anxiety disorders, and then some students who have chronic medical conditions, GI conditions, other migraines, things like that. And then also some students who have sensory impairments, so visual or hearing impairments. So a good wide range. And then the accommodations are really individualized for the specific student. It could be in the area of academics, it could be housing, it could be PE, it could be an accommodation they need to participate in an orientation outing. So any and all things student accommodations, students can come to us. We are the one-stop shop for that. Um, Two students with the same condition might end up with a different accommodation plan from our office, just because we do look not just at, what diagnosis do you have, but what does it look like for you? Two students with anxiety might experience it really differently and have different accommodation needs. So we do definitely take your students' own experience into account as we're developing their accommodation plan. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Maddie for a bit.
Hello. So As part of our accommodation plan or the process for the student working with us, how do we determine a student's eligibility for accommodations? As Jess has mentioned, our process is very individualized, and it centers around what you can see in the middle of our screen here, which is the interactive process. As far as what that means, really that is referring to just a conversation and or a back and forth that we have with the student to learn more about them, their past experiences, what's gone well, what hasn't, and so on. And we use that information to help identify the root of the barrier and to determine what accommodations would be appropriate or reasonable, particularly in the college setting. So through that interactive process, we learn more about the student's disability and the impact of their disability on their functioning and how that interacts with the environment that they're in. In this particular case, generally, it's the academic environment when we're exploring academic accommodations. An example of that would be a student who experiences a disability that impacts their reading and processing speed, maybe resulting in a slower processing speed or a slower rate of reading. Um, when that slower processing speed is then paired with the environmental factor of a timed exam, that could potentially result in the student not having equitable access or an equal opportunity to show their content knowledge. So through that interactive process, learning more about the student's disability, we can identify the root of the barrier there and maybe determine that something like extended time on exams could be an appropriate way to address the access barrier that they experience as a result. We also want to note that we approach our accommodations process in the spirit of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was centered around inclusion. And so our goal is to ensure that students have the same chance to do the things that their non-disabled peers are doing and have the same chance to fulfill the requirements that their non-disabled peers are also required to fulfill. And so for that reason, we center our process around supporting students in fulfilling those requirements rather than first exploring exempting a student or giving a student permission not to do something. So, for example, Reed has a PE program where students are required to complete a certain amount of PE credits for graduation. And if a student has a concern about their ability to complete that requirement, we would first explore ways to integrate them into the PE program and make adjustments in order to support them in completing that requirement before we would explore completely exempting them from a particular requirement in that case.
Okay.
We also wanted to highlight some differences at the K through 12 and high school setting versus the college setting. So accommodations at the college level can work a bit differently than in the K through 12 system. Um, While most students often find that they may end up with similar accommodations to the ones they used in high school, they may also see that they differ slightly from what they've used in the past. And there are a few reasons for that. Firstly, the different laws that inform the work we do and what is considered appropriate or reasonable within the college setting. So in K through 12, those are informed by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And in the higher education realm, we work within the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So under IDEA, for example, at the high school level or the K through 12 level, it may be okay to modify a requirement for a course or even for graduation for a student. Whereas at the college level, students will need to meet the same learning outcomes, course requirements, and graduation requirements as their peers. So a high school IEP plan may include scaffolding supports, such as reduced reading requirements initially and then building up to meeting fuller requirements later on. Where at the college level, we would provide or explore accommodations that would provide support in helping the student meet the reading requirements, such as alternative format texts for students who have reading disabilities or audiobooks, text to speech. We would explore those tools rather than reducing the volume of reading that they would be assigned in a particular course. Additionally, another difference, the K through 12 versus higher ed, is that in K through 12, the school may identify a child with a disability as someone in need of support, whereas in higher ed, the student is responsible for self-identifying as someone with a disability and initiating that accommodations request process. And the process of self-identifying would be contacting our office, filling out an intake form, and starting that interactive process. In the K through 12 setting, they may also provide services and assessments in order to provide documentation for a particular disability, whereas in higher ed, it is the student's responsibility for having that assessment completed and providing that documentation. Oftentimes, students may come to us with a copy of their individualized education plan or their 504 plan. Those are often, we find, great supplements to the documentation that we will dig into the details about in a bit more here. But we often find they don't quite capture all the information that we're looking for, or it's a range of what is showed in the 504 and IEP plans across different schools. So while it's a good supplement and a good starting off point, usually we look for information that has a bit more detail about the student's particular disability. Another piece I touched on is we aren't able to modify or reduce course requirements. And then lastly, our focus is more on access versus success. So accommodations are intended to ensure a guaranteed level of access, so a student isn't excluded, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee a certain level of success. For example, extended time on exams. I might meet with one student who has a disability that impacts their reading and writing processing speed, and they may say, they may find that what takes them 10 minutes or what their peers will complete in 10 minutes, they may take 20 minutes to complete. And they're consistently running out of time. They're unable to show their true knowledge on the subject matter within a timed exam setting. Versus I might meet with another student who's able to complete their exams on time and even has time to check their answers, and extended time allows them to triple check their answers, and then they get even better scores. In that particular case, student A may qualify for extended time on exams, where student B may not necessarily qualify for that accommodation at the college level.
Thank you, Maddie. I just want to touch just briefly. We are going to go into the documentation requirements in more depth, but we see quite a range, as Maddie alluded to, in the IEPs and the 504 plans. Some of them are really robust, and they include specific diagnoses and how they arrived at that diagnosis and the testing that was done and when and the functional impacts of the disability, and it's from the last year or two, and it has everything we need. And some of them may or may not have a diagnosis and just have like a short list of accommodations that the student sometimes used 5 years ago. Something like that would probably not be sufficient, and we would ask for some supplemental documentation that is a little more robust and a little more recent. And then, okay, so continuing with this theme of transitioning from high school to college. There are lots of changes happening at this time. This is a big transition for students and for the people who love them, for parents and families. I just had a kindergartner go to kindergarten for the first time, and that felt big. So I can only imagine what it's like for parents who are also transitioning to having, this person that's been with you taking on a lot more independence and agency. Often, especially for students with disabilities, up until this point, family members, parents have had to be advocates, pretty persistent advocates in the K-12 setting, and perhaps also a little bit of a CEO, helping with a lot of those executive functions that we externalize like planning, organizing, keeping track of things, making sure homework is getting done, keeping schedules, all in place. So a lot of those things are now going to be transitioned to your student. Um, so families often ask us, how can they support their student in this transition? There are a lot of ideas here. I share this to say, please don't feel overwhelmed and like this is all the stuff that you have to accomplish in the summer before your student arrives, right? These are developmental processes that all of us are still mastering as adults. But if there are one or two areas that stand out to you, like, ooh, yeah, my student might especially struggle with that one, or we should probably come up with a plan for, how this is going to make their transition more smoothly. This is a great time to maybe sit down and talk about that as a family. Um, some of the things that might have been supplemented by parents or schools that now are going to fall to the student. A lot of those are around the academic stuff, time management. That's a big one. So, in high school, a student might be used to having teachers break down assignments for them into smaller chunks, or they might be receiving frequent reminders to get things in. At the college level, it's going to fall to the student to do those tasks. We do have some academic coaching services that we offer here. So a student might be able to meet, that's offered through our academic support services office, which I'll touch on in a bit. Not our office, but we're in the same building. We work closely with them. So they could meet one-on-one with a student to say, yeah, let's break down this assignment into something that feels a little more manageable for you. Let's help you identify some deadlines. But then it would fall to the student to then follow through with those tasks. Um, some students, when we go back to the daily living bit, some students are used to having someone else help them wake up. So this might be a good time to explore what kind of an alarm system might be effective for your student. Um, if they do have, if they need regular access to medical care or mental health care, what's that transition plan going to be to ensure continuity of care? Some of it may be able to happen through our health and counseling services here at Reed. Some of it, students might want to seek, a provider in the Portland area. Sometimes students continue to manage their conditions just by touching base with their providers when they go home for breaks. So what your student's plan looks like will be individual to them, but good to be thinking about that. Do they know how to fill their prescriptions? Do they know how to find a provider? Um, Relationships. Sometimes we recommend that students and their families just talk a little bit about what can they expect communication-wise. Sometimes students don't really know until they get here. Maybe you'll feel it out, but sometimes parents find it reassuring to say, hey, if I text you, would you please text me back within 48 hours? Or could we at least make sure to connect once a week? I'm going to assume everything is fine, but this is when I'm going to start to worry. That can sometimes help have a clear communication plan, mainly for your own reassurance. And then, yeah, finances. Students might also need to know a little bit about their budget, tracking their board points. I also mentioned here just understanding their own condition and their own disability. Some students come to us really well versed in what their disability is, how it impacts them, the things that have been most useful. Some students come to us saying, I've had some accommodations. To be honest, I'm not even sure how some of them got put into place. Um, so it might be a good time just to see if your student can articulate, do they feel comfortable talking about their condition, how it's impacted them in the academic setting, why they're requesting certain accommodations, because those will be things that we will be asking them during our own intake process. Okay. So I want to pause and see if we have any questions so far related to things that have come up to now. Let me see. So one question is, yes, we've alluded to this supplemental information that we might need in addition to an IOP. What do we mean by that? Do we mean a neuropsychological assessment? And if so, can Reed provide that assessment? Yes, that is exactly what we mean. Some students have met with a psychologist or someone who can do more extensive testing to figure out if a student has ADHD or autism or a learning disability or none of the above, and will write a 10 to 20-page report. If such a report exists, that is really helpful for us to have. But not every student has that level of documentation. And we also wouldn't necessarily need that if a student is only seeking accommodations for, say, a mental health condition. In that case, we have a form on our website that providers can fill out that asks for all of the information that we would like to have. Providers can also write a letter, but usually we find that if they fill out our form, that pretty much guarantees that we'll get the information that we need. I'll go a little bit more into the documentation requirements in a couple slides. What do we mean by board points? Ah, yes, that is the amount of money that students have left to spend at Commons, which is where they eat their meals. So some students might find that they are running out of their board points by, October. So that's just one small example of ways that students can practice budgeting or managing their finances is by keeping track of their board points. Let me see here, and it looks like there's another one. Oh, sorry, the question of does Reed provide neuropsychological assessments? No. As Maddie mentioned, it is up to the student to provide, to seek medical treatment or seek an assessment and provide that to Reed. In some cases, our health and counseling center can provide some amount of documentation, but they do not do neuropsychological assessments. If there's a novel skill required for classwork, do you have any recommendations for students on how to identify if it's something that might require an accommodation versus an area where maybe it's more related to skill development, maybe needing to practice those skills? That sometimes happens just through a conversation with us. We can help suss that out a little bit. A lot of our interactive process is focused on, what is the access barrier that you're encountering? What is feeling challenging about this? What have you tried? What has worked? What hasn't worked? And then through that, Maddie and I would be able to say, oh yeah, it looks like there might be, an access barrier coming up here. This accommodation could be appropriate. Or we might say, oof, yeah, that sounds like you've never had to do a literature review before. Huh, this is a new skill. It requires so much tracking. It's really hard to keep track of all that information in one place. And then we would work with the student to figure out who's going to be able to be most helpful to you. And that it might be their professor. It might be our academic support folks. It might be a librarian who can show them sort of nuts and bolts how to do a lit review or a lit search. So we can help identify, is there an access barrier, or if it's a resource thing, what's going to be the best resource? Reed has a lot of resources. Students might not know what's the best place to go. It's easy for them to bounce around. And so that is one nice thing that our office or anyone in student life could offer. It's just helping to point them in the right direction. Okay, I'm going to pause on the questions for now, and I will take another look at them soon. So let's say that your student says, yes, I would like to request some accommodations at Reed. How do they do that? I think of it as being 3 steps. One of them is they have to fill out a form. So on our webpage, we have an incoming students website. It pretty clearly links students to, if you want to request academic accommodations, fill out this form. If you want to request housing accommodations, fill out this form. If you want to request both, fill out both forms. We also ask students to provide some disability documentation, and then we ask them to meet with us. For housing accommodations, sometimes we can process those without a meeting, but for academic accommodations, we do require a meeting with every student. One, again, that just gives us a chance to get to know your student better, craft an individualized plan for them, and then talk them through the logistics of how is this going to look at Reed? How are you going to talk to your faculty? How do you log into our DAR student portal every semester to request your accommodations? Once students fill out that form, we ask them to put their Reed email address in there. So this might be a change for some of your students. If they're not used to checking their Reed email, we ask that they please start. This is a good time because they will receive email reminders from us saying, hey student, here's your reminder. We got your form, but we don't have your documentation yet, and we need to receive it by, let's say July 15th. Um, so we'll send a few reminders leading up to July 15th, but if they're not checking their read email, they're not going to get those reminders. The other thing I'll say is, in the college level, it is up to the student to self-identify. Your student will be the primary person that we are interacting with. So we would ask that your student please be the one to fill out their accommodation request form. Your student will be the one attending their intake meeting with us. We will send emails to your student. From there, if they choose to forward those emails to parents, to family members, to other people, they're certainly welcome to do that. But our communication here at our office is going to be with your student. Um, Let me see. Yeah, and this might be a little bit of a time of transition, as we mentioned, for you and your student as they become sort of the expert on their own experience and speaking about their own needs. Let's see here. Yeah. So this is just a screenshot of our incoming student webpage. So as I mentioned here, there's a link that shows you our different forms. Uploading their documentation, they can do that right as they submit their form. There's a spot that allows you to upload some files. Let me see. The deadlines are for housing accommodations, June 1st is a pretty hard deadline. The reason for that is because very soon here, Residence Life is going to start assigning students to rooms. And so if a student has a need for a specific feature in a room or a specific type of configuration or, some kind of equipment in the room, anything like that, Residence Life will need to know that really soon so that they can assign a student to a room that would meet their needs. So unfortunately, the housing deadline is pretty firm. Students could request housing accommodations after that, but if rooms have already been assigned, we would be a bit at the mercy of whatever rooms are left over. So just to really make sure that we have a wide range of rooms to choose from when we're assigning students with disability needs to rooms, that June 1st deadline is important, including their disability documentation. Academics is much softer. We say July 1st as a soft deadline if students want to make absolutely sure that they're going to have their academic accommodations in place for the very start of the fall semester. I would say this is especially true for students who might need some accommodations that require coordination in advance. So students who might need captioning, who might need interpreting services, who might need sort of texts in a particular format, accessible PDFs, those things. We work with faculty over the summer to make sure it's all in place. So those, I would say, meet with us around that July 1st deadline. For other students, I would say, students meet with us all throughout July, August, even into September. Students technically can meet with us at any time, and we would just put the accommodations in place from that point forward. So again, July 1st, maybe more like July 15th, would be for students who are thinking that they just really want to have everything squared away by the first day of classes. Okay, and here's our disability documentation. So we do have a webpage where you can find all of this information. It's called Disability Documentation Guidelines. Let me see. And it will list out everything that we're looking for. It has that form that providers can fill out. The provider has to be someone who has been treating the student, has personal knowledge of the student, cannot be related to the student. So mom, dad, family member, if you happen to be a physician, I'm so sorry, you cannot fill out this disability documentation form on behalf of your student. Ideally, we'd like it to include a diagnosis so that we know what are the conditions, what are the symptoms that your student experiences. Again, the same condition can look fairly different for two students. So what's the frequency, what's the severity, how long do the symptoms last, how does it impact the student's functioning? For housing, right, how does it impact their housing needs? For academics, how does it impact their ability to take a timed test, to read, things like that? And the documentation should help us to connect the dots, right? We should be able to see a logical connection between the student's disability and how it impacts them and the accommodation that they're requesting. Um, so, for example, if we had, a student who says, um, I have diabetes and therefore I need, oh gosh, I'm thinking extended time on tests. Initially we might say, I don't clearly, sort of off the bat, I'm not seeing the connection between the impact of disabilities and extended time on tests. But if we had some documentation that explains, the student might experience unexpected changes to their blood sugar level, which then is going to severely impact their processing speed. They may need to take time away from their test to take some medication and wait until their blood sugar levels return to normal. This helps us to connect those dots so that we can see, okay. And then we might say, is it time? Do you need extended time? Do you need off the clock breaks? Do you need both? That's where that individualized process comes into play. But generally speaking, sort of the more detailed and the more individualized the disability documentation is, then the better job we can do of making those accommodations the right fit for your student. We talked about the 504 IEP plans a little bit. How recent does the documentation need to be? Um, there's no hard and fast rule, but I would say generally recent enough to speak to how this condition looks for the student today. Um, and I'll give a few examples. So, if we have a student who has, ADHD and we have a letter, an evaluation that was just from 1 or 2 years ago, that's probably still pretty representative of what their functioning looks like today, how ADHD is impacting them today. Um, Maybe we have a student who has dyslexia or a reading disability that was diagnosed in fourth grade, and we don't have any more recent documentation. That might actually still be okay if we can pair that with, a more recent 504 IEP plan. That's because a reading disability is one that's going to be fairly static throughout one's lifetime. Um, Mental health conditions tend to be notoriously a little more variable in how they can impact someone. So, for mental health conditions, we probably do want those ideally to be within the last 12 months. Again, just because anxiety during a student's freshman year of high school, they might be experiencing it really differently now, especially if perhaps they've been able to engage in some therapy or have found medication treatment that's really effective. So, recent enough to help us understand, how does this currently impact the student's functioning. Um, and students can always just, submit it to us. We'll take a look at it. And then through that interactive process, if we need more, if we need something different, we will be in touch with your student to let them know, hey, this is almost there. We need a little bit more about this. All right. Let me see here. It looks like we have quite a few questions. Sorry, Maddie, I was about to pass it, but we have quite a few questions in the chat. So I'm just going to take a look at those. Is there any support offered through DAR for navigating the social side of college, thinking particularly for neurodivergent students? Yes and no. There have at times been sort of, I think, group sessions or um, things offered through our health and counseling center, but those are not offered consistently every year. It depends a little bit on the expertise of the people who are on staff. Um, there are, however, I would say other workshops offered through the HCC around things like, like mindfulness or for students who have other identities that they share. There are other things that I would say don't have the overt goal of helping students navigate the social side of things, but might have sort of as a side effect, something like connecting with other students in a small group, or getting some strategies for emotional regulation that could also then help with the social side of things. We do also have, within the residence halls, there's programming offered by the HAs, the house advisors. We have our student engagement office, which could be a good place for students to go to if they're trying to connect with other students who have similar interests or, wanting to find clubs. Um, so those are a few of the ideas that come to mind off the top of my head. We do also have a couple of student groups. These are groups that are created by students and run by students. One is called the Disabled Students Union, and one is called CARDS. Oh, what is CARDS? I forget
Center
what the
for
acronym.
Access. Oh, I'm trying to commit that acronym to memory, but
Sorry.
Yeah.
Cards is another. We'll get back to you if you really want to know. Email us afterwards, and we will reply. But it's another basically group on campus that is focused around students who have disabilities connecting with one another for just being able to share their experiences. Sometimes they engage in some advocacy around campus. They painted a mural last year, for example. So that is another potential avenue. Um, what if a student with slow processing speed has not used speech to text technology, but now they might, okay, so maybe they were able to keep up with the reading before, but with the volume of reading at read, maybe now they're thinking that some assistive technology might be helpful. Can someone help them get them set up with this? Yes, that's me and Maddie. Is there a general provider, or is a general provider good enough? Oh, okay. So can your primary care physician speak to a student's condition, or does it have to come from a specialist? I would say that's going to depend on the student's condition, how well the provider knows them, to what extent has the provider been the person treating this condition. Um, so, for example, if a student says, um, they've gone to a primary care physician and said, I'm having some anxiety. And they say, okay, great, here's this medication that could help. That primary care provider might have pretty limited knowledge of what that student's condition looks like, versus if they've been working with a therapist, their therapist, maybe their licensed clinical social worker, might actually be able to speak much more in detail to what it looks like, how it's impacting the student. So the answer to that one is it depends. Okay, Maddie, I will let you speak about our intake meeting now.
All right. So, Jess covered the first two steps of our process, which is the intake form and documentation. Once those two pieces are completed, then we will invite a student to meet with us. They book an intake meeting with us through our online booking system. Oh, I see someone dropped the acronym for cards in there. Thank you. Um, and when we meet with you for an intake meeting, it's really a chance to get to know you as a student, learn more about your disability or condition, your history with it, any accommodation requests that you have. We can discuss in a bit more detail, accommodations that have worked well in the past, ones you've been issued that didn't work so well. Um, and so essentially, the student should be prepared to discuss how their disability impacts them and help us connect the dots between the requested accommodations and the impact of their disability. Um, we will likely have follow-up questions in order to help get there, in order to help gain that understanding. Some questions that you can expect are things like, hey, I see you have ADHD. Can you tell me how that shows up for you? What areas do you find most challenging? What symptoms do you experience in XYZ environment? How long do they last? How severe are they? What does that look like for you? Sometimes students may write in their intake form like, tests are hard. Great. That's a great starting off point. And during our meeting, I'll say, what does hard mean for you? And so, really, just getting a bit more into the details around the particular requests and again, understanding a student's experience and connecting them back to the barriers they may be experiencing. Sometimes, this is a one and done meeting. We meet, we determine a student's eligibility, we talk about next steps, send them on their merry way. Of course, we'll still be here for help as needed. Um, and there are other times where DAR needs to review requests and documentation a bit further. It's a bit more information gathering in nature. We may consult as a team or with faculty. Or when we meet, sometimes I meet with a student and a whole new condition comes up that wasn't mentioned, and we want to gather more information for that. And so we can provide next steps in order to talk further about any other things that come up during that meeting. So it can range as far as the time it takes and the commitment of time it takes. Sometimes, like I said, it's one and done, and sometimes it's a bit more of an ongoing back and forth. Um, so during the meeting, sometimes the student can be notified of their eligibility, and sometimes they're notified within a week or after we complete our whole interactive process and get all the information we need in order to establish what their accommodation plans look like. Um, And so if you are a student who thinks that maybe some of your accommodations may require a bit more coordination between us and other offices in advance, things like caption content, or if there needs if like class content needs to be converted to a different format in order to be accessible. What we would say, definitely we'd want to meet with you sooner rather than later. Otherwise, meeting with us by mid-August generally will put you on the right timeline. And having the request form submitted to us by that soft deadline of July 1st is ideal. And then, as Jess had mentioned as well, housing accommodation meetings are by invite only. And so with academic accommodations, we do require a meeting with every student, and for housing, those are just as needed. Invite only sounds very exclusive. As needed probably would be the more appropriate way. Very exclusive housing meetings.
Yes. I'm gonna just go back real quick, Maddie, sorry, to a couple more questions about the documentation
Please
before we
do.
move into the what happens next. One question was, do we need a separate form for each diagnosis? Um, I would say probably not. So, for example, if a student has ADHD and depression, if they've been seeing the same provider for both conditions, then certainly they could capture all of that in the same form. But if a student has, chronic migraines, and they also have OCD, and they've been seeing their primary care physician for the migraines, and they've been seeing a therapist for OCD, then yes, we probably would need two separate forms just because there's two separate providers who've been treating and who could speak to each condition. I hope that answers that bit. If there's any more questions, please feel free to add more. We might also need separate forms for different types of accommodations. So we will sometimes receive one form that speaks a little bit more to the student's needs in the academic setting, and then a separate form that speaks to the student's needs in the housing setting. Sometimes providers can combine it and put it all in one form. That's fine too, but I do find that often those arrive separately.
And with the accommodations request form that you submit online through our office, if it's multiple diagnoses, it is just one singular form, like the request form versus the documentation.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. So the intake form, or like the I am requesting an accommodation form, the student only fills that out once for academic accommodations, regardless of the number of conditions or disabilities that they have. But yes, then the sort of documentation form that comes from the provider, that's what I was just speaking to. Could you please repeat the had a diagnosis in fourth grade example? Yes, so what I was saying was if the condition is one that is a little more static and is going to impact the student the same way, most likely throughout the course of their life, for example, dyslexia or a reading disability that was diagnosed in fourth grade, for that student, there might not be a more recent full neuropsychological evaluation. But there might be, that fourth grade report plus a more recent IEP or 504 plan. And for that student, those two things combined might be enough. We might not need, a really recent full neuropsych eval. Again, super individualized. So we will work with your individual student and can also tell them more once we receive their documentation. Okay.
Oh, I also
Now,
see a question in the chat. Should a
oh,
request for a single room, just a single room, nothing else beyond that, because of a disability be done through the form, or is that unnecessary? If you're making any housing accommodation request due to a disability, definitely submit a housing accommodation request form through our office, please.
yep. Otherwise, they can request it as a preference through Residence Life, but it would be a preference and it may or may not happen. If it's something that a student feels is absolutely necessary, then that request would come through our office because if we were to issue it as an accommodation, it would be guaranteed for 1 year. Housing accommodations are issued 1 year at a time, and then a student could request accommodations again the following year if they need them. Academic accommodations, generally, students stay eligible for those for the time that they're at Reed. Okay, what happens next? So a student has submitted their documentation, they have met with us, we've figured out what accommodations they're using, then what?
Okay, so if we have established a student's eligibility, either within that initial intake meeting, then we will talk about these next steps and review them thoroughly with the student, or we will schedule a follow-up if we've had to do some further review in order to make sure we cover all of this. Um, but once a student has an established accommodation plan, we will set up a DAR student profile for them, and they will then be able to log on to our DAR portal and customize their accommodation requests for each course. And this is how they will go through and select which accommodations they want to apply to which class. And by submitting those, that's how they start the process of notifying their professors and faculty of what accommodations they are approved to use in their course. So during our meeting, we'll walk you through that process. And like I said, they can be individualized based on the needs in a particular class. So if there's a class that has a lot of timed exams, then and they have testing accommodations, then they'll probably want to request their testing accommodations. If it's a course where essays are going to be the main form of assessments that they complete over a few weeks, then testing accommodations may not be necessary. So that's how it can be individualized. And once they've gone through and made those selections, DAR reviews those and processes them, and then we send notification letters out to your professors and faculty. They're notified via email, and the students are also CC'd on that email, so they'll know when their professors have been officially notified by us. This is a bit different than an IEP or 504 plan, in that some of those included quite a bit of information in the K through 12 level about the student, um, like diagnostic information and things like that. What we share with with your professors and faculty are what your accommodations are. We do not typically share diagnostic information with them. And so once the professor has been notified of the accommodations, that's when some coordination should take place between the professor and the student. And that's another thing that we'll go over in detail during your meetings with us around what do you need to communicate with them about. It's not a conversation about whether you need these accommodations or why you need these accommodations. That's why DAR is here, and you've already completed that interactive process. It's more about the logistics. How is this accommodation going to work in their course? So for testing accommodations, if a student has extended time on exams, coordinating with that professor, am I going to arrive early or stay late to use that extended time? Or do we need to schedule an alternative testing time? How is this going to work? How are we going to communicate about those things? So that is what you'll be working out, what students will be working out with their professors on an individual basis. And of course, STAR staff will be here to support them as concerns or questions come up. We find that faculty are very receptive to accommodations, with 29% of Reed's student body being registered with our office. This is not a novel conversation for them, and we also take steps to train incoming new faculty who are new to Reed as well around this process and how to navigate these conversations too. So there will be students in every course that have a disability at Reed. Typically, we find that if a faculty member has questions or concerns, it's not due to any pushback around the accommodation itself. It's typically more so like, hey, how is this going to work in the format of my course? And that's not the student's job to coordinate with the professor about. If questions like that come up, please let us know, and the faculty can let us know, and we can be a resource to both the students and the faculty to help troubleshoot any logistical coordination or considerations in that regard too.
All right. Um, yes, yes, yes. Because a student's classes change every semester,
Mhm.
they will need to log in to what we call the DAR student portal at the start of every semester to make their accommodation selections, as Maddie described. We do send reminder emails out to students at the start of every semester. Reminder, the portal's open, submit your requests now. And we do encourage students to do that at the very start of the semester, just because there are some accommodations that are going to require conversation with the professor just to know, as Maddie said, how does this look in this class? And it might look different from one class to the next. And what other resources do we have at Reed? This is not everything. This is just an example of a few things that we have. So our office, we do accommodations, but we can also do referrals. So again, if the student's like, this thing's been really challenging, but I'm not quite sure where to go or what to do about it, by all means, they can come meet with us and we can just talk it through together. Um, Academic support. So this is the office that's housed in the same building where we are. They provide one-on-one coaching for students, so academic coaching, executive function coaching as it relates to academics. So, for example, they could help your student with, gosh, I find myself avoiding starting on this paper. Why am I avoiding this paper? Maybe it's because it feels overwhelming, or maybe it's because I feel like 3 weeks is a really long time and I don't have to start it just yet, right? So they can help your student figure out some strategies for, what might help them overcome, that barrier to initiating the task. They provide tutoring as well. There's a pretty great peer tutoring program here at Reed. I'd say many of our students who are tutors are students who themselves used the tutoring services earlier. I have to ask my colleagues, I don't know what the most updated number is, but a really large percentage of Reed students use tutoring. And I would say we often recommend to students to view this as not like a resource for someone who is struggling, but as a resource that most students will want to use in order to be able to do their best here at Reed. They also offer workshops around time management, study skills, note-taking skills, test-taking skills. Um, we also offer academic support, also offers like a sort of what other schools might call a transition or a bridge program, which is basically getting a small cohort of students who maybe after their first semester at Reed are thinking, oof, you know what? I feel like this transition was a lot. I could maybe use a little bit of extra support around things like how do I do college level writing? How do I talk to my faculty during office hours and make good use of that resource? Are my note-taking skills up to snuff? Are they serving me well? And so this is a short, or I guess a program that happens in the spring semester that students can self-refer to. Other faculty or staff can refer students to that program. It can also be just, again, like a nice way to connect with another small cohort of students, a chance to build connections in a smaller, maybe less intimidating setting. Um, we also have a Dean of Students office, and we also have a care team. They're somewhat connected, but I think of them as the my student is struggling, who can help place to go. So this might be for things that are not necessarily related to accommodations, but maybe more like, yeah, my student's just finding it really hard. Maybe they've gone through like some kind of, personal situation or financial situation or a relationship situation, just something that's making it so that this semester is feeling a little bit harder than ideally they would like it to feel. Or there's a financial concern and they just want to know, how could Reed help? Is there any adjustments that could be made to their financial aid? Pretty much any and all concerns can be directed to our junior students or care team. And then from there, they're a great point to get the student connected with the right place. We have a care team, again, as I mentioned. So that is a place where a professor, a student, a family member could write a note or submit a care team referral and just say, hey, I'm worried about my student. I noticed that at the start of the semester, they were really connected with me. I haven't been hearing from them, recently. I'm concerned that they've been increasingly isolating themselves. I just want to know, can someone check in, offer them resources, see if they could get connected to health and counseling. So you are welcome to submit whatever information you'd like to the care team referral, and then our care team manager, who is our director of student support, would take a look at that and figure out what feels like the most supportive, the most appropriate way that we can reach out to the student. Sometimes it might be a phone call. Sometimes it might be an email. Sometimes it might be connecting with residence life staff to say, hey, do any of you have a connection with a student? Can you check in with them? But they'll figure out what the good next step is. One thing to know, though, that typically as a parent or as a family member, you are welcome to submit information to us, but we may not be able to share a lot of information back with you. That is because of student privacy laws called FERPA. As you are going through orientations with your student, you will probably hear more about FERPA. But in a nutshell, basically, you can always share information with us, and then we can share back general information about how our process typically works, but we may not be able to share individual details. Um, Health and Counseling Center. So our Health and Counseling Center here offers basic medical and mental health services. They have some really talented counseling staff as well. So they can do some medication management. It depends on the particular medication that your student uses. They are, in some cases, able to provide stimulant medication prescriptions. They do have more strict requirements for being able to prescribe that in particular. So if you are concerned about that one, because that's one that's really hard to do across state lines, I would definitely recommend getting in touch with our HCC before your student arrives to see whether or not they'd be able to provide that service. And then we have other things. We have an Office for Institutional Diversity. They have a peer mentor group. They have some community service options. We have our Student Engagement Center where students can find activities, clubs, off-campus field trips, athletics and outdoor recreation, which also sometimes offers uh, cool outdoor field trips. And they have like a whole backpack co-op where students can go and like borrow and check out, outdoorsy gear. And then we have our professional residence life staff as well. So we have Residence Life has professional area coordinators who oversee the house advisors, who are the student staff in different buildings. So every residence hall will be associated with a Residence Life area coordinator who's also just a great kind of like general good person to go to if you have questions. I think that is what we have for you today, folks. So, what time is it right now? 4:30. Oh, wow. Okay, well, I was gonna say we have time for questions, but it doesn't look like we have that much more time for questions. But if there's anything that you really want to know, now's your chance. Also, you can email us. Also, if you go to our website, there is a link where you can book what's called a general information session. Um, Keep in mind, though, your students will still need to do the full intake meeting with us. But if you just have questions about like, what was the process again? What is the documentation again? Can you just walk me through this one more time, Jess? What are the deadlines? You can schedule a brief meeting with us to talk through some of that. All right. Well, in that case, thank you so much for attending. We look forward to working with your students and welcoming them to read in a couple short months. We wish you all a good summer until then.